Anyone who has spent a day on a Maine seabird nesting island can tell you that there's a certain unforgettable sound, sometimes even plaguing people's dreams long after their island trip. It's the chattering of a common tern ready to attack. These beautiful birds are elegant in flight, meticulous parents, and the guardians of the seabird colony. But what drives their behavior? We might find out tonight. We are so lucky to be joined by a special guest who studies these gorgeous birds and the aggression that they display. Tonight, we'll chat with Kay Garlick Ott, who will be broadcasting live from one of the Seabird Institute's research islands. Today's live chat centers around common tern aggression, what it means, why it happens, and what we can learn from it. I'm Gloria Jin, the Communications and Outreach Assistant for the National Audubon Society Seabird Institute. Joining me today is Kay Garlick Ott, PhD candidate at the University of California at Davis, who is currently live from Stratton Island. Thank you so much for joining us today, Kay. Would you like to introduce yourself and talk a bit about your role at the Seabird Institute? And how did you find yourself out on Stratton?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Kay. I'm about to be a fourth year PhD candidate at UC Davis. But before that, I worked for Project Puffin, the Seabird Institute, for 4 years, 2 summers as a research assistant on Eastern Egg Rock Island and then on Matinicus Rock Island. And then I supervised Eastern Egg Rock for 2 years before going to graduate school. And a lot of those experiences inspired what I'm now studying in grad school. And I feel really fortunate to be able to do my work out here.
Awesome. So we will be here to answer any questions that you have at the end of tonight's event. So if you think of any during the duration of the chat, you can drop any questions into the comments wherever it is that you are watching from. All right. So to set the scene, Stratton Island is a 24-acre island located in Saco Bay, 3 miles east of Old Orchard Beach in Maine. Stratton is notable for having the highest diversity of nesting water birds of any Maine island. The Seabird Institute actually began a tern restoration project on Stratton in 1986. However, predation has significantly impacted both tern numbers and breeding success since the beginning of this restoration work. Stratton Island hosts large tern and heron breeding colonies, filling the skies with common terns, Arctic terns, roseate terns, and even the tiny little least terns. Seabirds, particularly terns, must be diligent in defending their young against predators, but also other birds. It's a fiercely competitive world out there, and every birdie needs to look out for themselves. If you've been watching the Loafing Ledge, Boulder Berm, or Puffin Burrow exterior cams, you may have witnessed the sudden silence of a huge rush of terns taking off and swarming the skies. If you see on screen right now, that's a clip from one of our Boulder Berm cameras, exactly of that. Look at them go. Or you might have seen adult terns attacking each other on the rocks, even attacking chicks. Even still, competition between chicks can also be highly aggressive. Now I'll hand it over to Kay to talk a little bit about terns before we dive into her research. Kay, could you introduce a little bit about the biology of the common tern, also known by their scientific name, Sterna hirundo?
Yeah, so common terns are fairly well studied. They're pretty widespread, found globally. And then in North America, we have breeding colonies as far west as the Rockies, some even in the Great Lakes. But those numbers are sparser. A lot of the bigger colonies are located along the eastern seaboard as far south as the Carolinas. And then these birds will migrate down to the southern hemisphere, as far south as Argentina and Chile. A lot of the populations that we study in Maine go down there. But elsewhere you have migrations to other parts of the southern hemisphere. It just kind of depends on where your breeding colony is. And I guess a little bit about their breeding biology. They will lay 1 to 3 eggs per season. Um, Pairs are sometimes uh, they sometimes stay together year to year, sometimes they don't, although generally they do. And they're eating uh, forage fish mostly, at least in the colonies that we're studying. Elsewhere, they'll be eating other fish or invertebrates. We'll see invertebrates too in the diets of the terns that we study. But forage fish are including herring and pollock and butterfish and anchovy. And then we see other diet items too, and invertebrates, like I said, like shrimp and amphipods. Um, so it's they're fun to study and fun to see what they bring in, because sometimes there's also surprises. Like this summer, we saw a tern that was provisioning its chick with tunicates. So that was kind of surprising, and they seem to be specializing on tunicates. So we started calling it the tunicate tern. So that's fun. And other notable thing is that these birds are nesting. I keep saying colonies, and you can see these in the cams, but you have all these birds that are nesting in close proximity to each other, out on the ground, out in the open. So behavior is happening all the time. They're behaving when they're foraging and bringing back fish for their chicks. They're behaving when they're defending their territory between nests, which, like I said, can be within a foot of each other. And they're communicating constantly about their within pair needs. So two adults coordinating over who needs to go out and forage for the next fish. And so I think because everyone is living in such close proximity, behavior becomes really important as a strategy to maintain the peace and to figure out a lot of things that they need to navigate in their day-to-day lives.
It's actually really interesting. I think I just anecdotally, out on Seal Island, there's actually the two species of terns that nest out there, the common tern and the Arctic tern. And it's really interesting because whenever you walk into an area that has high densities of common terns, the sounds get just so much louder and the poop starts flying way more. And it's just super interesting to see kind of exactly what you were saying, like the behavior and just how much activity there is going on in on the seabird colonies. So now that we've established kind of some of the basic biology of the common tern, let's dive into what Kay is focusing on her research.
Yeah, so I think probably everyone who's listening to this has hopefully noticed this to an extent, that the terns are omnipresent in these colonies, and there's a lot happening all the time, and it can be pretty addicting to watch them. I feel like I've heard it compared to reality TV out here, and I think that's pretty accurate because there's always drama. And that's something that I noticed when I was working out here, when I was a research assistant on egg and Matinicus, where I would be watching these chicks receive feeds all the time. And they were kind of mean to each other. So, like, this is a picture of a feeding study that I did when I was a research assistant in 2018. And what I mean by feeding study is I'm following a subset of nests and learning all about what they're eating. So, the number and type and size of fish that are being brought in to be fed to one of the chicks at these study nests. And there's usually, I kind of glossed over this, but there's 1 to 3 eggs, and whoever hatches out first is the A chick, whoever hatches out second is the B, and whoever hatches out third is the C. And unfortunately, the parents, unfortunately for the C chick, great for the A and B, they get preferentially fed depending on their hatch order. So we're watching all these feeds come in, we're recording that. And you get really attached to the chicks and you begin to learn their little behaviors. And there was this one nest that was kind of at the edge of the feeding study. And whenever a fish came in, these chicks, it was really only an A and B at that point, and they would always battle it out for this fish and be very physical with each other. And there was one time I remember in that scuffle, one of them fell over the ledge that this nest was on and tumbled down 2 feet. It was fine. It actually made it back to the nest. But seeing that happen, I was thinking about how just through this behavior of sort of infighting between chicks of a given nest, there was an actual a physical consequence of that, where the bee chick fell down the ledge and then wasn't able to receive feeds for some amount of time. And you can think about how something like that could have consequences down the road for that chick, and for its survival. So that got me thinking about how behavior, even if it's something as inconsequential as just a little shove, could lead to actual survival consequences, for these birds. And so I wanted to go to graduate school, and I brought this idea to my prospective advisor, and then we kind of ran with that. And we're beginning to ask sort of, what if you could somehow measure or quantify the effect that these social interactions have on these birds, and somehow capture what it feels like to live in a colony with 1,000 other neighbors, and factor that in when you're learning about their survival and reproduction, and then more broadly their population outcomes. So that was the start of everything. And then obviously I had to distill that into research questions. So broadly, I'm interested in how aggression impacts tern survival and reproduction. I'm interested in what level. So does it matter just what you're doing, or does it matter what you and your neighbors are doing? And then whether these behaviors respond and their consequences respond to environmental factors like weather and resource scarcity, and even something local like the height of the vegetation around you. Because I think behavior can be so dynamic, and it's interesting to think about what it could be responding to.
That is super interesting. Thanks so much for kind of walking us through your thought process and developing the question too. I think that is something that honestly we kind of overlook, that research starts with questions. And I love how that story of the bee chick tumbling down the rock is kind of what inspired all of this. It's also really easy to think that, I guess, aggression in animals is a natural part of their lives, but as you were saying, there's just so many factors to consider. There is the obvious dangerous level of aggression, such as the ones that can lead to injury or death. But as you were saying about kind of the isolation from a food source or from being denied that chance at feeding, what are some of the more unseen effects of minor aggression?
Yeah, I think maybe the best way to describe it is to actually use a human example. So imagine if you went about your day, you left your house, maybe you had to go grocery shopping, and you just went around and started just shouting at people and giving them looks. And you did this to anybody who passed within a certain distance of you. That would probably be really tiring for you, and I would imagine would take some sort of emotional toll. And so I don't know if that really helps people think about the kind of effect that aggression can have. I'm sure another example would be if you're driving and someone does something really stupid in front of you, and you just get so angry, and that sits with you for the rest of the day. Right? So the bottom line is that aggression can have these physical consequences, but they can also have energetic costs. So the time that you spend both managing the aggression in your environment, but also participating in aggression as well, can have energetic costs. And that's energy that you're not spending on getting resources for yourself, on tending to your young, doing all the things that make you a successful individual as a bird. And so that's one way to think about it. And then there's plenty of evidence too that the sort of internal chemistry that happens that is responsible for aggression is at odds with the chemistry that you need to be able to reproduce successfully. So there's always a trade-off happening.
Mm, that's really cool. Um, so I guess with all of these things to look at and to consider, could you maybe introduce some of the methods that you're using to actually study these birds and kind of, I guess, quantify or qualify their behavior?
Yeah. So what I'm doing is I'm putting out GoPro cameras across the tern habitat that I'm studying, and I'm filming 3 times a day for 2 hours, and then retroactively going through and quantifying the amount and type of aggression that's happening in my videos for all the nests I can see in those cameras. Um, and the way that I do that is that I'll watch the video and I have this list of behaviors that I'm following. And I've categorized this list into behaviors that seem less intense, a little more intense, and then like really intense. And all of that's based on the risk of injury, which we kind of talked about, and also the energy expenditure. So the two things that make aggression costly. Um, and then my goal is to use all of these interactions that I've quantified to make a map that shows areas of high aggression and low aggression. And then from that map, I can extract values for an individual nest's aggression, as well as what the aggression of a neighborhood is. So I can contrast those values. And then I can also pair those values with other ecological parameters, like some of the ones that I was mentioning earlier. So vegetation height, weather, um, feeding rate, density, things that we already know may have an influence on aggression. But my goal is to kind of study them all simultaneously and also add in this element of social complexity.
That's super cool. I love that kind of the adding in the visual aspect too with a map is super interesting. And all the different categories and things that you have to consider in making all of these is super, super cool. And I also love that point of view clip that was shown during your explanation. Like that, that's actually so crazy. There's just
So,
nothing like this experience. And like if you could hear the sounds that these people are probably experiencing, it's just like none other. The ones that are just dive bombing the camera too. And speaking of cameras, cameras really do provide a non-invasive tool to study the wild and wonderful world of seabirds. And Kay's research is just demonstrating exactly that. And we know this well thanks to Explore.org's cameras out on Seal Island as well. Terns just are always super hyperactive, always on the move. Tracking their movements and observing this aggression seems like a lot of hard work, and cameras do help make it just a little bit easier. I guess maybe what are some takeaways that you would like the audience to remember?
um, I think I think we've all I don't know. If you're here, you're probably interested in behavior to some extent. I think behavior is a really great way for people to learn about animals, like especially passive observation. So if you're watching on a live stream or watching a nature documentary, these things are endlessly fascinating to people. And I'm here to say that not only is it interesting, but I also feel like it really matters in a conservation sense. I think behavior matters a lot. I know there's a lot of emphasis on how much food is in your belly, and that's really important too. But I think especially for animals that are social, um, uh, social behavior will impact how much food you can get. And so I think especially with uh, an environment that is rapidly changing, it's really important to learn about all of these indirect mechanisms that are not as well understood because we don't know really what's going to be important down the road. So that's one takeaway. Study behavior, it's fun and it's interesting and it goes and like the things that you see in these cameras are really cool and strange, and I think we need to pat ourselves on the back for observing them and give them credit. as interesting observations. Um, and then I guess I personally would love to be able to make even small scale recommendations for how to manage habitat so that aggression is either encouraged or discouraged. I'm not actually sure what is better yet. Stay tuned. But managing the habitat in a way that promotes a healthy social environment is of interest to me. Um, and and yeah, I think also I guess the last thing that I would say is I would love to be able to say I know why you're being aggressive to me and what that means for you. So I guess that's another another sort of hopeful impact that I would like to have in the future.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like I like to think of whenever a bird is being aggressive to humans, it's like, oh, it's probably protecting its young. Like you hear stories about bikers in Australia having to wear helmets because um, just magpies will come and peck their head off. But and then it just comes to bird on bird aggression is just something that seems so kind of detached from us or something that is like we don't really think about that. And so the fact that you're kind of really studying this and putting so much thought into exactly why and what is going on in the entire colony is just really cool and it's something to look forward to as your research continues. And as a reminder for those of you who are watching, Kay will be answering questions that come in from tonight's live event. So let's keep them coming. If your question doesn't get answered tonight, or if we maybe have a follow-up to it, we will try to get answers for you in the comments or maybe in another future live event. Um, okay, so we'll start with a question that I've actually seen a few times in the explore.org comments. I think at this point, a lot of our viewers are familiar with the common tern chicks on the boulder berm camp, who are, puttering around. They were formerly fluffy, now they are flapping their wings as hard as they can. Um, they are always, though, begging for food from their parents. But sometimes we can also see adult common terns who also stand on the rocks and seem to be begging for food and can be aggressive towards those chicks. Do we maybe know who these adult terns are and what might they be doing?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of reasons why they might be doing that. I think if it's within the pair, so one of the adults in a pair, one of the parents begging from the other adult in the pair, and maybe this is even before they've laid, that could be a direct indication that they are reproductively ready. So it could be a signal that, okay, let's do this. I wanna lay an egg with you. Um, it could also mean that they want food. So it could be a signal that they have nutritional needs. Um, it could be if it's not within a pair where there's a clear intention to mate, if there's a tern that's just begging from everybody, that's interesting and different. And there's a lot of reasons why that could be. Some for the same reason. So it could be, again, this nutritional need, that they're just kind of co-opting that initial behavior to try to get others to feed it. But it could also be that they, I like to imagine that they could just be practicing. Maybe they're an immature individual and they're not quite ready to reproduce, but they want to try it out, try the behaviors and see what happens. So that's another possibility. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think just anecdotally, we've also seen this go the other way, where there are kind of teaser terns who go around with a little fish in their mouth and try to stick it in other terns' faces. And those terns are kind of like, oh, yeah, like free food, sure, I'll take it. And when they actually do latch onto that fish, the teaser tern will just start relentlessly pecking at them, pulling at their wings, and making them drop the fish. And then they'll just pick it right back up and start offering it to other terns too. And it's like, why are you doing that? But I guess it's just kind of another one of those really interesting things to study about these little terns. And obviously, we've been talking a lot about common terns since that is the focus of your research. But here's a question that I actually had. Do you know if this level aggression within species shows up in the other terns, such as the Arctic roseate or least terns that the Seabird Institute also monitors?
Yeah, I think on the in the colonies that the Seabird Institute manages, we generally see the common terns as being the most aggressive, both towards humans and also kind of with each other. Um, I think the Arctic terns, the roseate terns, um, and the least terns definitely don't seem to dive bomb or poop on us quite as much. That's definitely notable. I think broadly, though, those differences, I don't know whether they are maintained. I have heard anecdotally that least terns living with other species can be more aggressive than the least terns we have here. And so I think, and that makes sense to me because I think that aggression is a really dynamic behavior, and so it's responding to different resource conditions, different densities, different cohabitants, other species that could be living there with the colony in question. So yeah, maybe not satisfying, but I think it is colony dependent to an extent.
Okay, very cool. Um, and here's an interesting question from Michelle. She says, I heard that the terns protect fledgling pufflings from the gulls. Is this correct? And if so, how do they do this?
So the fledgling pufflings, they benefit a lot from fledging at night. So that's I love this clip. Sorry, I don't mean to get distracted. They benefit a lot from fledging at night, so they're able to avoid predators that way. That's one way that they do that. But it is broadly known, or at least through decades of observation, interpreted that the terns provide some sort of enhanced social environment for the puffins. Some people refer to it as a safety blanket. That sort of observation is part of why was part of Steve Kress's initial social attraction plan. Bring the terns back would help enhance the puffin colonies, but really, I think that idea of terns as a safety blanket, I'm trying to get at that a little bit with my research, but a lot of that's still yet to be thoroughly researched. So if you're out there and you want to study it, a cool future question to sort of explicitly test.
Ooh, okay, that's interesting. Um, and I just, yeah, that clip is so funny to me. Just the puffin chick from the burrow this year is just struggling, and there's so many turns on the rocks, and she's doing her best to not like go too close to them, but while she makes her way up to the tippy top. Um, that's awesome though. I love that kind of safety blanket analogy because I guess it is really true. They provide a lot of protection from predators for the puffins, and yeah, I mean certainly it is an aspect to it. Um, all right. So I have one last important question for you, okay? I'd like to ask what your favorite tern behavior is to study and why.
Okay, so I knew about this from leading up to it, so I had time to think about it. Um, my favorite behavior is this what is called in the literature and what I call a high intensity threat display. So how do I describe it? So the tern will put its wings up like this. Oh, yes, that's it. Open its bill really loud and make this grating sound that is phonetically it's spelled Keearrrr, a descending like keyar and like goes down. And it's super obnoxious. And that's why I love it, because it's so ostentatious and nobody likes it. Like no one living near a tern that does that likes when they do that, because they're raising ar- their arms, their wings up, and it being really disruptive. Um, there's no reason to be that disruptive. But I just find it really entertaining, and they often get into fights after that. So yeah, so
That is so cute. And I love how that there's a phonetic that is spelled out, and I feel like it just perfectly describes that noise that they make because I can hear it. I can see them screaming it as well. And it's just that the visual is incredible. And so thank you so much for everyone who has submitted questions before. And now if there's any questions that have come in during the live chat, we can get to those now. Okay, so one viewer asks, if aggression is so costly, why would terns tend to be aggressive? What benefits does that give them?
yeah, so that's a great question. And I guess I've mostly talked about some of the costs, so the energetic costs, the physical costs. But one way that we understand aggression more broadly in their life history is as a necessary behavior to living in big groups. So aggression helps keep the peace because it makes sure that you're not encroaching on your neighbor's territory. It also makes sure that if there's a harmful predator nearby, that you can successfully defend yourself and your colony against them. So in those earlier videos that we watched, when the entire colony gets up and goes after a single predator, that's definitely a benefit of aggression. But these things are always in trade-off. So you get the benefits of living in this big colony and having your territory and defending against predators, but then there's also the costs. But so long as those benefits outweigh the costs, you're going to keep doing it. And for the terns, it seems to be paying off.
That it is. Although for as far as aggression towards humans goes, we're the researchers are still out there. They're not going anywhere. Awesome. All right. So our next question is, does infighting between chicks help them later in adulthood?
That's a really cool question. And don't I don't think we totally know, although there is some evidence that being more competitive as a chick helps you later on. But the jury's kind of still out on that one. I know that a lot of that is regulated too by sort of your internal composition. So like hormones that even as early as when you're in the egg, during egg formation, the mother birds will deposit certain amounts of these hormones into the eggs, and that can actually influence you as well, how much aggression you're exhibiting. So my guess is yes, and that it sticks with you through into adulthood, and I'm sure your experiences also shape that. But yeah, another great future research direction for all the future scientists out there.
Yeah, and I guess I also wanted to share kind of a perspective that Dr. Don Lyons shared about research with other seabirds about that. I think I forget exactly which species of bird this was. I think it was one of the boobies or gannets. But there was a study done about bee chicks, so the younger chick. Usually in some species of birds, the firstborn or the A chick will actually kill its sibling in a show of dominance to kind of have that competitive edge. But in those birds, the ones where the B chick was actually successful in fighting off the A chick and killing its older sibling, there was an increase in testosterone that had kind of lasting effects into that chick uh, throughout adulthood because as they studied the bee chicks that would come back as adults, they were shown to be more aggressive towards chicks, even though they were adults. And so I'm not sure if that was like some sort of lasting thing in their brain or if it was their hormones, but just something really interesting to keep studying later on. So that's a great question. And our next question is, have you noticed that certain species of terns are more or less aggressive in the colony? Are the number and type of species nearby also considered beyond just other common terns?
Yeah, so at least on Stratton, the parts of the common tern colony, it's just common terns nesting together. And I'm mostly focusing on those areas, just to keep my study focused on within species interactions. But it's a great question, and I think to answer the first part of it, have you noticed that certain species of terns are more or less aggressive in the colony? Yes, common terns are definitely more aggressive, and then least terns and roseates and arctics, at least on Stratton, seem to be less aggressive. And then we do one of the areas that I follow. There's a lot of traffic with common eiders and Canada geese, and they loaf through my videos, so it's easy to account for them in my data. But unfortunately for them, the common terns do like to bully them, and so it has happened a couple times at least where in my video all will be serene and quiet, and then suddenly I'll just see this like brown shape moving through the edge, like fleeing, and I'll hear all the sound of that. So I am considering it. My
Wow, that's actually really interesting. Yeah. I think we've seen just I I feel like the terns are just very visual. If it looks like a threat, they think it's a threat. Even if it's an osprey, which only eats fish, or such as we've seen on, I think it was Jenny Island, if it was a mourning dove, that looks a little hawk-like, the terns will chase after it and completely freak it out. And that clip that was just played of Willie, the puffin burrow male puffin, being herded back into the burrow by a tern who was having none of it. All right. Oh, this is an interesting one. Is there any distinction between male and female tern aggression? Is one more aggressive than the other?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I believe the answer is yes. And it kind of depends on the time during the season. Uh, there's I remember reading a study, and I confess that I don't entirely remember uh, where this was conducted, but they suggested that the males will do most of the territory defense, and the females will do most of the incubation. And I think my impression was that even though that's been shown, it could be shown again. And I think there's a lot of work that could still be done to um, flesh that question out and explore it more. So in my research, I'm thinking more about the experience of aggression. So regardless of who's doing the behavior, what effect does that have as sort of like a broader experience in space and time? So I'm not thinking about that quite as much, but it's a good thing to consider.
That's actually really interesting. That's not something that I had thought of, mainly because I feel like just because the males and females look the same, it's just I kind of forget that, there is a distinction in their behavior too. That's really cool.
It's one way.
Um,
It's one way uh, adults can coordinate at their nest so that one adult isn't working too hard. And there's always
mm,
trade-offs in terms of who's doing more work. So
yeah.
this is one way that they'll sometimes divide tasks. But like I said, more research could be done to show that.
That's awesome. All right. And I think this is our last question. So the question is, how do you modify aggression?
Is that is it possible to is what does modify mean?
I'm actually not really sure. Maybe it's in the context of, I guess, like how you're studying it, if there's different levels of it. I guess I'm not really sure.
Change, yeah. Um, so I'm not actively modifying their behavior. Um, or at least I'm taking great lengths to not modify their behavior. Because that would then influence my results. So but I do think that there's a lot of things in their environment that do modify their behavior. So those are the factors that I'm really interested in. Um, and an example would be I mentioned this earlier, but I can go into it in a little more depth, vegetation height. So let's say that you're nesting, and like I said before, these guys are nesting on open ground, um, in close proximity with each other. And so let's say that you're sitting there on your nest and your neighbor is just going off about something. um, that might affect you more if you can see them, uh, just to put it plainly. So, um, like maybe your neighbor Bill is really upset about something, and but you can't see him, so he's just that guy on the other side of your fence. Um, that might not modify your behavior as much. But if you can see Bill and he's being really disruptive and it's kind of freaking you out a little, that might modify or change or affect your own experience with aggression a little more. So you might be more aggressive as a result. Um, I'm not sure if that's the direction that the question asker was going in, but that's what comes to mind for me as far as things that can shape behavior. Um, yeah.
Yeah, I think that is just pretty much what I wanted to know from that question too. Like, I especially love the kind of perspectives that you've put us in through kind of connecting us with the Terns and what they're experiencing. And it's so true. Like I was thinking, yeah, if I could see Bill being angry, I would be angry too. But if I can't, I don't know. I would just be like, oh, Bill, you're just so angry all the time. And I love that. Yeah, it's just the environmental factors is so cool. And I really love that that's kind of what you're studying, and learning more about it with you is really, really cool. And so thank you everyone for submitting such amazing questions. For any questions that we couldn't get to, or maybe you have when you're watching the recording of this, feel free to ask them on the Asana form or in the comments. Um, we'll try to get to them in a future featured comment maybe, or elsewhere in the chat. And I'd like to give a huge shout out to our wonderful guest, Kay, for being here tonight. The Seabird Institute's research informs real and lasting decisions that we can make to improve the lives of seabirds and the health of our oceans. Beyond being fierce protectors of the entire seabird colony, terns are important sentinels of ocean health. Um, in those feeding studies that Kay was mentioning, we are able to get better ideas of all the fish and how they're doing, as well as how the birds are doing. So without the work of dedicated researchers like Kay, this project would not be possible. Thank you for all your hard work and, of course, for joining us tonight. And just to wrap things up, Kay, do you have any last words that you might want to add?
Um, Thanks for having me. This was awesome. And I guess for all you CAM viewers out there, just keep making those observations. Behavior is fascinating and it does mean things. So don't write yourself off. It's really cool what you're doing.
Heck yeah. And keep an eye out on those little terns on the boulder berm. We're cheering for them and hope they get nice and big and fledging soon enough. So thank you all for tuning in tonight. As always, it's a pleasure to hear your comments and questions. Please look forward to the next edition of these live chats. And in the meantime, stay tuned to all of the Audubon Seabird Institute's live cams. So many of our tern chicks have actually already started fledging. Those little guys that are brownish with the white foreheads to their black caps, those are the little fledglings. And we'll soon see most of the puffling cohort also departing. So don't miss out. Thank you and have a great evening.